In this video, we're going to talk about conditional reasoning. Specifically, we're going to discuss if, only if, and unless when they are used in conditional statements. The first major signifier of a conditional statement is just the word if. And the usual way that we do this is just with an if-then statement. So imagine that we said something like, if Abigail goes to the party, then Frank will also go to the party. So if A, Abigail, then F, Frank. In order to represent this conditional statement, we're going to draw out something like this, where we have A on the left side of an arrow, and then F on the right side of an arrow. That just reads, if A, then F. And in order to use this, we just start on the left and say, what happens if A is true? Well, we follow the arrow to find out, and we see, oh, F happens. This left side of the conditional statement is something that we call a sufficient condition. We call it a sufficient condition because A is sufficient, it's enough for us to infer F. If Abigail goes to the party, it's not like we need to know more information to figure out if Frank's going to go. No, we know now that Frank's going to go to the party. We know that if Abigail goes to the party, then something's going to happen, that we get to infer that F will also be at that party. The right side of the conditional statement is called a necessary condition or a required condition. We call it a required condition because the left side, the sufficient condition, needs the right side. It requires the right side. It depends on the right side being true. So if Abigail goes to the party, then since we know that F has to be true under that scenario, then that means that in order for Abigail to go to the party, in order for that to be true, Frank must go to the party. To think about this another way, let's just start with the fact that, let's say we know for a fact that Abigail is going to the party. Let's just assume that we know that to be true. Well, according to this conditional statement, we now know something else. We know that Frank is also going to the party because if Abigail, then Frank. That means that in all situations, in every single situation in which Abigail goes to the party, Frank is also there. So what happens if Frank doesn't go to the party? What happens if we find out that Frank isn't going? Well, now we know something, right? Because we know that Abigail, therefore, is not going either. Because if Abigail was going, guess what? Frank would be going too. So without Frank, there is no Abigail going to that party. So if Frank doesn't go, then Abigail doesn't go either. That means that Abigail needs Frank in order to go to the party. That means that this left side of our conditional statement requires the right. It needs the right in order to be true. If the right side of the conditional statement isn't true, then the left side can't be true either. And this formulation of the conditional statement that we wrote down here with not F, then not A, this is known as the contrapositive. In order to reach our contrapositive, all we have to do is flip the statement, put our right side on the left and our left side on the right, and negate both sides. So in this case, that comes out to if not F, then not A. If Frank doesn't go to the party, then Abigail also does not go to the party. And we're allowed to infer that from our original conditional statement. And we're allowed to do that because of the fact that Abigail requires Frank. By the way, if you have trouble remembering which side is which, then just think to yourself, that required condition, the one that's required, that's needed, that's necessary, required on the right. RR, required on the right. So let's get back to talking about if. So if in this context, if in the context of a conditional statement, signifies a sufficient condition. So if A, our term with if, that was the sufficient condition, the one that we put on the left side of our arrow. And this is true even if we change up the order in our English sentence. So if we said Frank is going to the party if Abigail goes to the party. Well, this is the same information just delivered in a different way. If we said Frank is going to the party if Abigail goes to the party, well, that's just saying if Abigail goes to the party, then Frank goes to the party. And even though we've moved the location of the if in our sentence, if still signifies that sufficient condition. And we still put A on the left side of our arrow. So what about only if? If I said Abigail goes to the party only if Frank goes to the party, then what am I actually saying here? I'm saying that Abigail needs Frank in order to go to the party, that Abigail requires Frank. In other words, Frank is required by Abigail. Frank is a required condition, a necessary condition. And this is a trick. When you see only if, this is kind of a tip that you can use. Only if signifies a required condition. Only if signifies the right side of the arrow in our conditional statement. So in this case, since we have only if F, then F's going to go right here on the right side. And this is the case even if we change up the order in which we put our variables in our English language sentence. So if I said only if Frank goes to the party, will Abigail go to the party? Well, I haven't actually changed our information. I've actually changed the real content of the conditional statement. I'm still saying that Abigail requires Frank. I'm still saying that Abigail needs Frank in order to go to the party. So only if here still signifies that required condition, and it still goes to the right side of our arrow. So let's consider the difference between if and only if for a moment. Here we have a if F, and over here we have a only if F. So let's take a look. Now remember, if signifies a sufficient condition, whereas only if signifies a required condition. So on the left here we have a if F. Well, that's going to translate to F being our sufficient condition, so it's going to go on the left side of our arrow, whereas A is the required condition, and that's going to go on the right side of our arrow. So that's if F, then A. Over here we have A only if F. Well, that means that since F here only if signifies a required condition, so that's going to go on the right side of our arrow. That leaves A as the sufficient condition, and it's going to go on the left side of our arrow. So if we say A if F, well, that's going to give us this formulation of a conditional statement, which is just F requires A. And over here we have A only if F, and that's going to give us this formulation where we have A requires F. So you can see that if and only if really signify very different conditional statements. On this side we have that F implies A. Now on this side we have that A implies F. And knowing the difference between these two can make a huge difference in your score on the LSAT. So what happens if we combine these two statements? Imagine, for instance, if I said A if and only if F. So what have I done here? I've taken the if from here, and I've taken the only if from here, and I've put them together, that A if and only if F. Well, the if here signifies a sufficient condition, which implies that F is a sufficient condition. But the only if signifies a required condition, which means that F is also the required condition. So what do we do with that? Well, if you take a look, if we have A if F, that implies if F then A only if F, that implies if A then F. So essentially what we have here under this A if and only if is that we have F implies A, and we have that A implies F, which means it works backwards as well. And this is a biconditional statement. F if and only if A. So F now implies A implies F. And that's why if and only if signifies a biconditional, because it's just the combination of if, which signifies a sufficient condition, and only if, which signifies a required condition. Finally, let's talk about unless. If I said that A is going to the party, Abigail is going to the party, unless Frank goes to the party, then what do we do with that? How do we infer a conditional statement? In order to really understand this, we have to understand what unless means on the LSAT. We want to take it very literally. So what we're saying here is that A is going to the party. We're saying Abigail is going to the party, unless F goes to the party, unless Frank goes, in which case, I don't know, we don't know if Abigail's going or not. So notice here, it doesn't mean that Frank going implies that Abigail isn't. That's not what this statement says. This says that Abigail is going unless Frank goes, in which case, who knows? Maybe Abigail goes, maybe Abigail doesn't go. We just don't know under that scenario what the result is. In other words, what we know here is that, hey, you know what? If Frank doesn't go to the party, if that doesn't happen, we know something. We know that Abigail's going. Because Abigail is going. Unless, of course, Frank goes, in which case we don't know. So if Frank doesn't go, well, guess what? Now we don't have to worry about this unless statement. If Frank doesn't go, then, well, great. We know something. We know Abigail is going. In other words, if not F, if Frank doesn't go, then Abigail goes to the party. And that's the conditional statement that we're allowed to infer from this. And the contrapositive, remember we flip and negate both sides, would just be that if Abigail doesn't go to the party, then Frank does. And we're allowed to infer this from our unless statement as well. So the shortcut here is just to imagine that unless just means if not. So imagine that it says if not. Now remember, if signifies a sufficient condition. So if goes on the left side of our conditional statement arrow. Thus we would say F on the left side in this case, but we're saying if not. So we want to negate that and say if not F, so not F, then what? Then we just put A on the right. And that will work every time with an unless statement. And that's true even if the unless is the beginning of the sentence. So if our sentence read, unless Frank goes to the party, Abigail is going to the party. When we treat that the exact same way. We imagine that this said, if not F, so we would just say, okay, F is the sufficient condition because of if, and negate the F, then what? Then A in the required condition. And that's how you handle unless statements. So to summarize, if signifies a sufficient condition, only if signifies a required condition, and unless is just the same as if not. In other words, it signifies a negated sufficient condition.